The mist hung low over the rolling hills of rural France in the early spring of 1931, curling through the narrow lanes and settling in the hollows where the land dipped into shallow streams. The villages, few and far between, seemed suspended in a different era, untouched by the modernity creeping across the country cities. Cobbled streets were silent except for the occasional clatter of a horse's hooves or the creak of a wooden cart. Smoke rose in thin spirals from chimneys, carrying the scent of wood smoke, damp earth, and livestock, an aroma that clung to the lungs and the memory alike. It was a world of quiet order, of routines dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, where everyone knew everyone else, and outsiders were regarded with suspicion, curiosity, or sometimes outright fear. Amid this sleepy landscape, there existed one household that was both known and unknown, familiar yet shrouded in rumor. Locals spoke of the family only in whispers, careful to keep their distance yet unable to resist the pull of morbid curiosity. The family had lived in the same isolated farmhouse for generations, its walls darkened by years of neglect, its windows shuttered against prying eyes. Children who passed by were warned to stay away, and adults muttered tales over pints of wine in the village tavern, tales that seemed almost too strange to be true, yet were repeated with the conviction of those who had glimpsed them from afar. They called them the closed family, a name that carried no small measure of dread, though few could agree on why. The last son of this family was said to be the final living thread of a lineage that had existed quietly, privately, and peculiarly for decades. No records existed beyond the few official documents in the parish registry, and even those offered little more than names, dates, and brief mentions of births and deaths. Yet in the imagination of the surrounding villagers, he became a figure both tragic and unsettling, a child born into secrecy, whose very existence seemed to illuminate the dark corners of rural superstition. People wondered what it meant to grow up in a home so closed off, under the watchful eyes of parents who trusted no one, who spoke little to anyone outside their walls, and who seemed to guard secrets that went beyond mere family privacy. There was something almost architectural in the way the village itself framed the story. The farmhouse sat at the end of a winding dirt lane, flanked by overgrown fields and dense patches of forest. No footpath led directly to it, and travelers often found themselves forced to navigate narrow, uneven tracks that twisted around hedgerows and streams. The house, constructed of rough stone and timber, appeared older than it should have for its time, its facade weathered by decades of storms, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of moss and damp. Windows were either shuttered or glazed with a layer of grime that obscured the interior, leaving the impression that the occupants might be watching the world outside while remaining completely hidden themselves. Even from a distance, the place exuded an aura of secrecy, a sense that stepping through the threshold would take a visitor into another realm entirely, one governed by rules and routines known only to the family within. Rumors about the household were varied and often contradictory. Some villagers claimed the family was cursed, the result of generations of intermarriage or hidden sins. Others whispered of strange rituals performed late at night, or of children who seemed unusually frail, silent, or fearful. Still others insisted that the family was no different from any other, yet that the very act of isolation had warped perceptions so thoroughly that every small detail was exaggerated into horror. Over time, these stories coalesced into a kind of dark folklore, one that was passed down alongside the practical knowledge of farming and the cycles of the seasons. For the villagers, the closed family was a puzzle, an enigma that resisted understanding, and in resisting understanding, it became frightening. In this atmosphere, the last son was born, though the news of his birth reached the village only in fragments. Parish records noted the date, but there were no announcements, no celebrations, and no visitors allowed. He arrived quietly into a household already steeped in silence and secrecy, his cries heard only by those within the stone walls. The parents, like their ancestors before them, seemed almost to brace against the intrusion of the outside world, raising their child in a bubble of privacy that was at once protective and isolating. As he grew, he became both a symbol and a victim of the family's chosen seclusion, a living testament to the patterns, fears, and habits that had defined his lineage for generations. The natural world surrounding the farmhouse seemed to mirror the family's internal life. Fog rolled through the trees like ghostly visitors, and the winds carried the scent of damp leaves and decaying vegetation. Animals moved cautiously, their calls echoing eerily across the hills. Even the seasons themselves seemed to emphasize the family's detachment. Winters were harsh and silent, with the farmhouse trapped under blankets of snow that isolated it further. Summers brought long shadows across the fields, making the land seem larger and more empty than it truly was. In this landscape, the last son's life unfolded largely unseen, a narrative that would later become the focus of whispered speculation, historical investigation, and dark fascination. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, this isolation, the story demanded attention. There was an undeniable tension between what was known and what was hidden, between the village's rumors and the sparse official records. The closed family embodied a paradox. They were at once ordinary and profoundly strange, human yet distant, visible yet elusive. Their story raised questions about inheritance, secrecy, and the human capacity for both protection and harm within the confines of family. It invited a deeper contemplation of what it meant to grow up in a world carefully curated to hide the truth, and what happens when the last living member of such a world emerges into the broader landscape of history. This tale of the last son of a closed family in rural France is more than an isolated curiosity. It is a lens through which we can examine the intersections of history, psychology, and social dynamics. It is a reminder of how isolation can distort perception, how fear can warp reality, and how a single lineage, hidden away in the folds of the countryside, can leave a legacy both haunting and instructive. As the story begins to unfold, it asks the viewer to confront a chilling possibility, that some families are not merely private, but secret in ways that touch upon the darkest corners of human experience. It is a story of absence as much as presence, of silence as much as speech, and it is in this tension between what is seen and what is hidden that the true intrigue of the last son emerges, a figure poised at the edge of history, memory, and mystery, waiting to reveal the truths his family long sought to conceal. The world outside the farmhouse where the last son would spend his early years was one of quiet struggle and slow transformation. France in 1931 was a nation still healing from the wounds of the First World War, and the effects were particularly pronounced in rural areas far removed from the urban centers of Paris, Lyon, or Marseille. The scars of conflict were not only physical but social and economic, shaping the rhythms of life for families whose livelihoods depended on the land, livestock, and the fragile stability of local markets. Villages dotted the countryside like irregular stitches, each self-contained, each with its own rules, hierarchies, and peculiarities. The roads connecting them were often little more than dirt tracks, prone to flooding, rutted by carts, and lined with gnarled trees whose roots seemed to claw at the passing traveller. It was a France of isolation, where modern conveniences arrived slowly, and where the weight of tradition held a grip on daily life stronger than the promise of progress. In these villages, the social order was rigid. Families were judged not only by the size of their harvests but by their adherence to customs, religious observances, and local expectations. Parish priests carried influence that reached far beyond Sunday sermons, their words shaping morality, reputation, and communal memory. Gossip travelled swiftly along the narrow lanes, filtering through market squares, taverns, and farmsteads, and it often took on the texture of legend, especially when it concerned families who were reluctant to participate in community life. In this environment, a household that kept itself apart, that shut its doors to neighbors and whispered little to outsiders, was immediately conspicuous. Suspicion, curiosity, and fear intermingled in equal measure, forming a potent mixture that could define a family's legacy long after the details of daily life were forgotten. Economically, the period was challenging. The Great Depression, though its full force would hit France a few years later, was already rippling through rural communities. Crop prices were unstable, smallholders struggled to maintain their holdings, and the margin between survival and destitution was perilously thin. Subsistence farming dominated, with families planting what they could, tending livestock, and relying on shared resources and seasonal labor. Isolation compounded these difficulties. A household that refused or failed to engage with neighbors risked missing crucial knowledge about farming techniques, weather patterns, and market opportunities. In some cases, it was mere pride or stubbornness that kept families apart. In others, it was fear, secrecy, or the desire to preserve certain traditions unobserved. For the family in question, the latter seemed to dominate. Their seclusion was not born of mere laziness or eccentricity. It was deliberate, calculated, and, in many ways, defensive. Education and literacy were another lens through which the era's isolation becomes visible. Rural schools existed, but access was uneven. Teachers were often itinerant or undertrained, and the curriculum focused on basic literacy, numeracy, and moral instruction, usually rooted in Catholic doctrine. In families like the closed household, formal education could be minimal or heavily supervised. Some parents taught children at home, adhering to a strict regimen that mirrored their own beliefs, habits, and fears. Others, particularly in families suspicious of outsiders, avoided sending children to school altogether, fearing contamination by outside ideas or corruption by the influence of peers. The result was a childhood shaped as much by omission as by instruction, a world curated to the family's own standards, where curiosity was both nurtured and constrained, and where the mind was left to wander in the confines of an insular, often opaque reality. Superstition and folklore held considerable sway over rural life. Belief in spirits, curses, and the unseen was common, and these beliefs were reinforced by the natural rhythms and dangers of rural existence. Crops could fail inexplicably, livestock might fall ill or disappear, and storms could destroy everything in an instant. In such a world, it was easy to attribute misfortune to supernatural forces or moral failings. Families who lived apart, whose routines were mysterious, or whose members behaved in ways that defied local norms often became the focal point of these fears. They were seen as harboring secrets that might invite disaster, or perhaps as protectors who warded off unseen malevolence. The duality of fear and fascination created a fertile ground for legends, and the last son's family existed squarely at the center of such a narrative, even before he was born. The infrastructure of rural France at this time amplified isolation. Transportation was slow, and communication with the outside world depended on letters carried by infrequent postal services, telegraphs that required travel to the nearest station, and the occasional visit by traveling merchants. Electricity and running water were limited, often confined to larger villages or towns, leaving smaller households reliant on candles, oil lamps, wells, and pumps. Medical care was equally scarce. A village might have a doctor, but reaching one required hours of travel on roads that were barely more than tracks. Illnesses that would be minor in urban areas could become life-threatening in the countryside. This combination of remoteness, limited resources, and reliance on tradition created an environment in which families developed their own coping mechanisms, rituals, and sometimes dark habits, insulated from scrutiny and intervention. Culturally, rural communities prized continuity. Lineage, inheritance, and the preservation of family honor were paramount. Children were expected to uphold the family's name, work the land, and adhere to established norms. The idea of stepping outside the family's defined boundaries, physically, socially, or morally, was fraught with tension. For families who already kept themselves apart, this created a feedback loop. Isolation bred oddity, oddity fueled suspicion, and suspicion reinforced further seclusion. In such an environment, the actions of parents and the conditions of upbringing could have profound and lasting effects, particularly on the youngest and most vulnerable members of the household. Against this backdrop, the life of the last son was shaped from the very beginning. His existence was intertwined with a landscape of silence and subtle danger, a society governed by rigid hierarchies, limited knowledge, and the ever-present possibility of rumor. He was born into a household whose walls were as much a barrier against the outside world as they were a protective cocoon. The broader context of rural France, the economic precarity, social scrutiny, reliance on tradition, and isolation from modern infrastructure, served both to shelter and to limit him, creating the conditions for a childhood steeped in secrecy, suspicion, and quiet tension. This context also illuminates why the story of the last son continues to captivate. It is not merely a tale of an unusual family. It is a lens into a society on the cusp of modernity yet still bound by centuries-old practices, fears, and hierarchies. Understanding rural France of the 1930s allows us to see why isolation could be both a choice and a necessity, why secrecy could be protective yet suffocating, and why the lives of those who existed outside communal norms became fertile ground for mystery, rumor, and sometimes tragedy. The last son's upbringing was therefore not an anomaly in isolation. It was the product of a broader world that was itself strange, harsh, and morally complex. The family at the center of this story had lived in the same remote corner of France for generations, their presence marked more by absence than by visibility. Parish records trace their lineage back to the mid-1800s, noting births, marriages, and deaths with the dry, mechanical precision of bureaucratic documentation. Yet outside of these sparse entries, there was little tangible evidence of their lives. The family seemed to exist in a world apart, their routines unrecorded and their interactions with neighbors rare, leaving only the echoes of whispered tales to fill the gaps. Over time, the locals began to see them not merely as a family but as a phenomenon, a household that resisted the rhythms of ordinary rural life. Each generation seemed to reinforce the pattern of withdrawal, creating a legacy that was as much about secrecy as it was about survival. From the earliest accounts, the family's reputation was built on subtle signs of difference. Neighbors described them as strange or reserved, words that carried heavy weight in a community where conformity was the foundation of social order. The patriarchs and matriarchs of the family were known to follow rigid routines, rising and retiring with the sun, tending their fields and livestock with meticulous care, yet shunning social gatherings, markets, and communal religious events. Children rarely played with others outside the household, and the family home was shuttered, doors bolted against visitors and windows curtained against prying eyes. This level of isolation was unusual even in a village accustomed to self-sufficiency, and it quickly became a source of speculation and discomfort for those who observed them from a distance. Over time, stories of odd behavior began to circulate. Some villagers claimed that members of the family spoke in hushed tones, even when alone, as if engaged in secret conversations. Others noted unusual dietary habits or strange rituals, though the details were often contradictory. One elderly farmer recalled seeing the family burning certain herbs in the hearth, while another insisted he had glimpsed cryptic symbols scratched into the wooden shutters of their home. These accounts, whether rooted in fact or exaggeration, contributed to the sense of the family as something beyond ordinary understanding, a lineage in which normal rules did not apply. Medical observations, however, suggested another layer to the family's mystique. Parish records hinted at a history of hereditary illnesses, and local midwives noted that children were often born weak or frail. Some exhibited developmental delays, unusual physical traits, or peculiar behaviors that set them apart from other village children. In a society with limited medical knowledge, these differences were easily attributed to curses, bad luck, or moral failings, reinforcing the idea that the family was somehow touched by forces beyond comprehension. Yet modern perspectives suggest that genetics and isolation played a significant role. Consanguineous marriages, common in some rural areas to preserve property or maintain lineage, could have contributed to the appearance of hereditary conditions, while social withdrawal amplified the perception of strangeness. The parents of each generation cultivated an atmosphere of control and discipline that bordered on the obsessive. Reports suggest that rules governing the household were strict, leaving little room for deviation. Children were expected to work the land, tend the animals, and maintain the home, all under the watchful eyes of their elders. Leisure was limited, and play, if permitted at all, was carefully supervised. Some accounts even hint at forms of psychological pressure, children being shamed or isolated for minor transgressions, their behavior constantly monitored and corrected. The effect on successive generations was profound, producing individuals who were both self-reliant and profoundly socially constrained, shaped by a combination of fear, obedience, and isolation. Despite, or perhaps because of, these restrictions, the family demonstrated remarkable resilience. The land was farmed efficiently, livestock maintained, and resources conserved with precision. Outsiders might have expected a household so isolated to fail economically or socially, yet the family endured. Their ability to survive in an unforgiving landscape, coupled with their strict internal order, reinforced the duality that made them both admirable and unsettling to the surrounding community. They were capable, resourceful, and meticulous, yet their very competence was intertwined with secrecy, creating a tension between respect and apprehension in those who observed them. Stories of their behavior were compounded by a sense of ritual and superstition. Villagers often spoke of the family observing private ceremonies at odd hours or engaging in practices that seemed incomprehensible to outsiders. Some speculated about the use of old herbs, charms, or symbolic markings, while others believed they communicated with unseen forces or guarded hidden knowledge passed down through generations. Whether these claims were accurate or exaggerated, they contributed to the aura of mystery, framing the family as a living relic of a time when folklore and daily life were inseparable. In this way, the household became both a subject of fear and fascination, a cautionary tale of what might happen when a lineage retreats too far from communal norms. Within this context, the last son's birth carried a particular weight. He was born into a household already steeped in secrecy, a living continuation of patterns established long before his arrival. His parents' behaviors, shaped by generations of isolation and suspicion, created an environment in which his development would be heavily influenced by both nurture and the peculiar circumstances of the family's history. The child's earliest experiences were framed not by the communal life of the village but by the private world of the household, where rules were absolute, routines rigid, and contact with the outside world limited to necessity. This upbringing, while protective in some respects, also ensured that the boy's world would be narrow, strange, and, to outsiders, unsettlingly foreign. The family's reputation extended beyond mere eccentricity, reaching into the realm of the macabre. Villagers recounted incidents of unexplained disappearances or sudden illnesses among family members, though records were scarce and often contradictory. Some accounts described fainting spells, unexplained fevers, or sudden deaths that were attributed to either hereditary weakness or divine punishment. Others claimed to witness behaviors that defied conventional explanation, moments of intense silence, sudden outbursts of emotion, or the meticulous care of objects and spaces in ways that seemed obsessive. Whether these events were factually accurate or amplified through the lens of rumor, they contributed to a growing perception of the family as a household apart from the rhythms of ordinary life, governed by rules and patterns that outsiders could not comprehend. Ultimately, the family story is a study in contrasts, ordinary yet strange, visible yet hidden, human yet distant. They were shaped by the demands of rural life, constrained by economic and social pressures, and yet simultaneously bound by self-imposed rules and inherited patterns of secrecy. In the landscape of early 20th century France, such a household could exist for decades largely unobserved, their peculiarities recorded only in whispers, brief parish entries, and the occasional traveller's notes. It was in this complex interplay of isolation, tradition, and inherited behavior that the last son's narrative was forged, a life poised between the ordinary and the extraordinary, shaped as much by history and environment as by the personalities and choices of those who came before him. The household was dominated by the figures of the parents, a father and mother whose personalities seemed to cast long shadows over every corner of the farmhouse. The father was a man of stern disposition, his presence commanding and unyielding. Villagers remembered him as tall and gaunt, with a gaze that seemed to measure everything and everyone, never satisfied with partial truths or unfinished tasks. His hands were calloused from years of labor, yet there was an exactness to the way he handled his tools, arranged his fields, and supervised the work of his children. It was as though he believed that control over the physical world could safeguard against the unpredictable forces of fate, illness, or misfortune. Discipline within the household was absolute, and even the smallest infractions were met with quiet but unmistakable correction. This rigidity, while harsh, was not cruel for its own sake. It was the logic of a man who viewed the family as a delicate ecosystem, one that required careful tending and constant oversight. The mother, in contrast, embodied a different kind of authority, subtler but equally pervasive. She was quiet, almost ethereal in her movements, and yet her influence was felt in every aspect of the household. Villagers spoke of her as enigmatic, a woman whose eyes seemed to hold unspoken knowledge and whose words were measured with precision. She managed the domestic sphere with meticulous care, overseeing food, clothing, and the maintenance of the home, while also enforcing rules of behavior and conduct. There was a sense of ritual to her actions, meals prepared at the same hour each day, laundry washed and folded with exacting order, and objects placed in precise arrangements that defied casual observation. Some suggested that her insistence on order extended to the children's education, social interactions, and even their play, guiding their development in ways that were invisible yet profound. Together, the parents created an environment in which control and secrecy were inseparable. The household functioned like a small, self-contained world, with routines and rules that dictated not only what was done but when, how, and even why. Meals were eaten in silence or accompanied by hushed conversation. Chores were performed according to rigid schedules. Leisure was allowed only within carefully defined boundaries. Outsiders were discouraged, and visitors were rare, arriving only when absolutely necessary. When they did appear, they were met with a polite but unmistakable wariness, as if the family understood that the world beyond their walls could not be trusted. It was an environment in which the last son would learn, from the earliest days of his life, that control and vigilance were inseparable from survival. The psychological impact of such an upbringing cannot be overstated. Children raised in households governed by rigid authority often develop a heightened awareness of rules, subtle social cues, and the potential consequences of misbehavior. In this family, these tendencies were amplified by isolation and the parents' insistence on secrecy. The last son grew up in a world in which the outside was largely unknown and the internal world meticulously monitored. Every action, word, and expression could be observed and corrected. Over time, this created a duality in the child's experience, a sense of security within the ordered household, paired with an undercurrent of fear and anxiety, the knowledge that deviation could provoke reprimand or disapproval. The father's approach to discipline was both practical and philosophical. He seemed to believe that life itself was harsh and unyielding, and that children must be prepared for this reality from an early age. Mistakes were not punished through anger or cruelty but were corrected with precision and insistence. A child who failed to complete a task properly would be required to redo it until it met the exacting standards set by the father. In this way, work became both training and indoctrination, instilling habits of perseverance, attention to detail, and an understanding that the world would respond to effort rather than complaint. Yet beneath this practical logic lay a darker dimension. The imposition of absolute control created an environment in which freedom, curiosity, and spontaneity were constrained, shaping the child's perception of possibility itself. The mother complemented this control with what might be described as psychological guidance. She monitored not only actions but intentions, observing the subtleties of mood, tone, and expression. Her presence was often silent, yet the weight of her gaze could enforce compliance more effectively than words. She taught the children lessons about propriety, discretion, and the importance of appearances, ensuring that their behaviors would not draw unwanted attention from neighbors or visitors. Her influence was subtle but profound. She created an internalized system of self-regulation within the children, teaching them to anticipate correction before it arrived, to conform to unspoken expectations, and to internalize the household's norms as though they were universal truths. Despite the strictness, the household was not devoid of care or affection. There were moments, fleeting yet memorable, in which the parents' concern for the child's well-being was evident. Illness was attended to promptly, meals were prepared with care, and the rhythms of daily life provided a structure that, paradoxically, offered a sense of safety. But even these acts of nurture were bounded by the household's rigid logic. Affection was conditional, measured against the standards of conduct and obedience, and never free from the overarching atmosphere of control. The last son learned that love in this family was inseparable from performance, discipline, and secrecy. The parents' personalities also shaped the household's relationship with the outside world. Their mistrust of neighbors and strangers was both instinctive and learned, reinforced by generations of self-imposed isolation. They seemed to view the village with suspicion, interpreting ordinary interactions as potential threats, gossip as an instrument of harm, and curiosity as intrusion. This created a feedback loop in which isolation bred eccentricity, eccentricity bred rumor, and rumor reinforced isolation. The household became increasingly impermeable to external influence, existing as a small, tightly controlled universe with its own internal logic, values, and hierarchy. Within this environment, the last son's early experiences were defined by both the comfort of routine and the weight of observation. He learned the rhythms of the household, the precise timing of meals, the ordering of chores, the unspoken rules governing behavior. He absorbed the lessons of obedience, vigilance, and discretion, all reinforced by the constant presence of his parents' authority. Yet he also sensed the tension beneath the surface, the fear, the unspoken rules, and the awareness that deviation could have consequences beyond immediate correction. These early lessons would shape his identity, fostering both resilience and anxiety, independence and constraint, curiosity and caution. In the broader context of rural France, the family's strict internal order set them apart, but it also provided a shield. They were largely insulated from the economic pressures, gossip, and moral scrutiny that shaped the lives of less isolated households. Within the walls of the farmhouse, they could preserve their customs, maintain their secrets, and protect their lineage from external interference. The parents' personalities, while demanding, were central to this protective function. The father's insistence on labor and precision, combined with the mother's psychological guidance and attention to detail, created a household capable of surviving both the hardships of rural life and the pressures of social judgment. Ultimately, the household was a world defined by control, secrecy, and the inescapable influence of the parents. Every element of daily life, from work to play to interaction with outsiders, was shaped by their presence, authority, and rules. For the last son, growing up in this environment meant learning the delicate balance between obedience and independence, visibility and concealment, safety and restriction. The parents' personalities, with their combination of sternness, subtlety, and meticulous attention to detail, created a framework within which he would develop, adapt, and, inevitably, struggle, shaping not only the contours of his childhood but the trajectory of his entire life. The last son entered the world quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the dim light of the farmhouse, his first cries barely piercing the heavy silence that seemed to dominate every corner of the home. His birth, like so many events in the household, was observed with precision and formality rather than celebration. There were no neighbors invited, no midwives lingering to offer advice beyond what was strictly necessary. His parents treated the arrival as both a continuation of a lineage and a responsibility to maintain the household's delicate order. From the very beginning, he was enveloped in a world where everything was structured, controlled, and observed, a world in which freedom was measured, and curiosity was carefully guided. The early months of his life were marked by the rhythms of the household, rather than the spontaneous chaos that characterizes most children's infancy. Meals were prepared and fed at the same time each day, and the infant's routines were carefully aligned with those of the adults. Sleep, feeding, and care were not left to improvisation. They followed the meticulous schedules dictated by the parents. Even play, when allowed, was limited to small, contained exercises that served to teach order, patience, and obedience rather than amusement. In such an environment, the last son's awareness of structure and consequence developed early, forming the foundation for a childhood that was at once disciplined, sheltered, and profoundly isolated. The physical environment of the farmhouse played a critical role in shaping his earliest experiences. The rooms were dimly lit, lined with heavy wooden furniture, and filled with the subtle smells of wood smoke, cured meat, and the earthiness of the surrounding fields. Windows were small and often shuttered, allowing only slivers of light to enter, reinforcing a sense of enclosure. The sounds of the outside world, birds, wind, rain, distant voices, were muted, creating an auditory bubble that amplified the presence of the household itself. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric, every soft footstep of the parents became significant to the child, instilling an early awareness that the household was a microcosm in which he existed under constant observation. The parents' influence extended beyond mere routine. The father's presence was a mixture of authority and silent guidance. He would often watch the child intently, gauging responses, correcting posture, and instructing even through subtle gestures. The mother, equally attentive, seemed to communicate through nuance, a shift in expression, a carefully timed word, or the placement of an object that required the child to learn observation, deduction, and anticipation. From these early interactions, the last son developed a keen awareness of consequence, a sense that his environment was both protective and exacting. Every choice, even in play, had meaning and potential ramifications. Social interaction was severely limited. Encounters with neighbors or other children were rare, and when they occurred, they were brief and heavily supervised. This isolation prevented the child from developing the normal social skills associated with peer interaction. He did not learn the casual give and take of friendship or the shared negotiation of childhood play. Instead, he was conditioned to navigate a household that demanded attention to hierarchy, awareness of surveillance, and adherence to rules that were sometimes unspoken. The consequence of this was a childhood rich in observation and internalized discipline, but impoverished in the external social experiences that define most lives. Health and development were also shaped by the household's peculiar circumstances. Records suggest that previous generations of the family had experienced various hereditary conditions, and there were early indications that the last son might be susceptible to similar issues. The parents, aware of this, took meticulous care to monitor his growth, diet, and behavior. Herbal remedies were used for minor ailments, often accompanied by precise rituals intended to protect against illness or misfortune. The limited exposure to external medical care meant that the family relied almost entirely on inherited knowledge, observation, and instinct. While this ensured vigilance, it also amplified anxiety, as every cough, fever, or unusual behavior could be interpreted as a signal of hereditary weakness or impending danger. Education, in the broader sense, began at home. The last son was taught to read and write under the careful supervision of his parents, but the content and methods were idiosyncratic. Lessons were rigidly structured, often incorporating moral and religious instruction alongside basic literacy. Knowledge of the outside world was selectively imparted, filtered through the lens of the household's values and the parents' desire for control. Curiosity was encouraged only when it could be harnessed in service of discipline, observation, or skill development. Unsupervised exploration, either intellectual or physical, was subtly discouraged, creating a mind shaped by observation, reflection, and a cautious engagement with the unknown. Psychologically, the child experienced a complex web of attachment and apprehension. The parent's constant vigilance created a paradox. He felt safe within the ordered structure of the home, yet he was perpetually aware that deviation from the rules could result in correction, disapproval, or even silent withdrawal of affection. This duality fostered both resilience and anxiety, independence and constraint, curiosity and caution. The child learned to anticipate consequences, to read subtle cues, and to internalize the household's norms, preparing him for a life in which survival depended on keen observation and adherence to invisible rules. Even within these constraints, the last son's personality began to emerge. He was observant, cautious, and highly attuned to the behaviors of those around him. Yet there were also signs of curiosity that could not be entirely suppressed. Small acts of rebellion, questions that lingered unasked, and moments of quiet experimentation with the environment. These tendencies were simultaneously encouraged and disciplined, creating a delicate balance in which the child's development was shaped both by the structure of the household and the inevitability of his own instincts. The landscape surrounding the farmhouse further shaped his early experiences. The rolling fields, dense forests, and fog-shrouded hills offered both a playground and a boundary. While the child could explore within these spaces, the outside world remained largely inaccessible, distant, and mysterious. The physical isolation mirrored the social isolation, reinforcing the sense that the household was a universe in itself, self-contained and governed by its own rules. Encounters with the natural world were filtered through observation and caution, instilling both a respect for the environment and a recognition of its potential dangers. By the end of his early childhood, the last son had internalized the rhythms, rules, and expectations of the household to an extraordinary degree. He had learned to navigate a world in which structure and secrecy were paramount, where observation and anticipation were essential, and where freedom existed only within carefully defined boundaries. The interplay of routine, parental vigilance, isolation, and selective exposure to the world beyond the farmhouse created a foundation that would shape his adolescence, his understanding of social norms, and his eventual encounter with the broader realities of rural France. In many ways, his early life was both ordinary and extraordinary, ordinary in its domestic rhythms, extraordinary in the intensity of observation, control, and isolation that framed every experience. Outside the walls of the farmhouse, the village lived its quiet, measured life, a world seemingly untouched by the passage of time yet ever watchful of the household that lay at the edge of the fields. To the villagers, the family was a puzzle, a dark thread woven through the familiar rhythms of their own lives. Children were warned not to wander too close, not out of malice but from an ingrained sense of caution. Adults offered polite nods if they happened to meet a family member on the road, yet their eyes often lingered a moment too long, curiosity mixing uneasily with fear. Over time, the family became more than a household. They became a symbol, a living cautionary tale that represented the consequences of secrecy, isolation, and difference. Rumors about the household circulated relentlessly, growing in complexity with each retelling. Some villagers claimed that the family was cursed, the result of sins committed by ancestors long dead, a notion that carried a weight of inevitability in a community steeped in religious belief and superstition. Others suggested that there were strange rituals performed in the dead of night, or that the family engaged in practices that defied ordinary morality. One old woman swore she had seen figures moving behind the windows at dusk, the shadows bending and twisting as though the household contained more than ordinary humans. Children, in particular, were both fascinated and terrified. They told stories at school and in the fields, embellishing every detail until the line between fact and imagination was nearly impossible to discern. Even among adults, the perception of the family was shaped by a combination of fear and fascination. Farmers spoke in low tones about the efficiency with which the family tended their land and livestock, acknowledging skills that bordered on uncanny. There was a grudging respect for their competence, yet it was always tempered by the sense that these abilities were somehow unnatural, a product of the family's isolation and their obsession with control. Outsiders visiting the village occasionally mentioned the family, but often with hesitation, aware that any open discussion risked incurring the suspicion of neighbors who preferred to keep the matter unspoken. The household's reputation had become woven into the very fabric of local consciousness, a subject that could be neither ignored nor fully understood. Local authorities were aware of the household but treated it with a mixture of caution and resignation. Police reports contained only occasional mentions, usually related to minor disputes or missing livestock, but nothing that required sustained intervention. The family's refusal to interact extensively with the outside world created a buffer, insulating them from legal scrutiny while simultaneously heightening the air of mystery. Parish records, carefully maintained, documented births and deaths but offered no insight into the daily life of the household. Even the priest, who wielded considerable influence in rural communities, admitted that his knowledge of the family was limited and largely anecdotal. In this way, official records and community memory coexisted uneasily, leaving the family to occupy a space between fact and legend. Neighbors described a series of subtle signs that reinforced the household's enigmatic reputation. Smoke from a chimney would appear at unusual hours, or the children might be seen moving silently across the yard, their shadows long and deliberate in the afternoon light. The family's livestock were well kept but seemed to behave differently, calmer or more alert than animals from other farms. Visitors occasionally reported overhearing strange sounds, low murmurs, the shuffle of furniture, the echo of footsteps in empty rooms, though these accounts were never fully verified. Each fragmentary observation became a seed for rumor, and rumor, in turn, grew into narrative, creating a dense web of speculation that enveloped the family and their last son in a haze of intrigue and unease. The children of the village, particularly, played a unique role in perpetuating the family's reputation. They were simultaneously curious and cautious, drawn to the mystery yet warned to maintain distance. Stories of the family circulated at school, on the way to market, and along the banks of the river, each retelling layered with embellishment and fear. One child might claim to have seen a ghostly figure at a window, while another insisted that the family was guarding a treasure or a terrible secret. Adults, overhearing these tales, often dismissed them as childish exaggeration, yet the repetition of such stories reinforced the perception that the household was different, unknowable, and potentially dangerous. The village's fascination was further fueled by the family's occasional, controlled interactions with the outside world. When the father or mother did venture to the market or the parish, they moved swiftly and deliberately, exchanging minimal words, leaving a trail of impression rather than information. Such appearances were brief, formal, and precise, emphasizing the household's boundaries and the parents' insistence on privacy. The last son, in these early years, may have witnessed these encounters, learning that the outside world was both distant and unpredictable, a place to observe cautiously rather than to engage freely. This tension between familiarity and fear was heightened by the family's physical seclusion. The farmhouse itself was difficult to approach, set back from the road and partially obscured by hedgerows and low-lying woods. Visitors often reported a sense of unease as they navigated the winding path, the landscape itself reinforcing the household's separation from ordinary life. Even when one could see the windows, the interior remained obscured by curtains, shadows, or the subtle manipulation of light and placement within the rooms. It was as if the house itself were an extension of the parents' insistence on control, an architectural manifestation of secrecy that mirrored the social and psychological isolation imposed upon the last son. Over time, the village's perception of the family became a mixture of fact, rumor, and interpretation. The household was acknowledged as real and tangible, yet simultaneously elevated into legend. Minor incidents, an unusual illness, a fire in the hearth, a child wandering too far from the path, were imbued with moral or mystical significance, reinforcing the narrative of the family as a unit apart. Even the absence of action, such as the family's refusal to attend social events or participate in communal rituals, became a statement, interpreted through the lens of suspicion and imagination. The last son, though only a child, was already a figure in this larger narrative, observed, speculated about, and, in a sense, defined by the eyes of those who kept him at a distance. The result was a household that existed in multiple realities at once: the private reality of the family's internal life, structured, ordered, and meticulously controlled, and the public reality of village perception, filled with rumor, superstition, and partial observation. The last son's early years were lived entirely within this dual framework, shaping not only his understanding of the household's rules but also his sense of self in relation to a world that was both present and largely inaccessible. Every glance, every whisper, every fragment of observation from neighbors contributed to a sense of surveillance, not hostile but intensely aware, which would influence his awareness, behavior, and perception for years to come. In this way, the village's fascination and fear were inseparable from the household's identity. The family became a living mirror, reflecting back the anxieties, curiosities, and superstitions of the surrounding community. The last son's early life, though sheltered, was observed indirectly, recorded in the collective memory of the village and in the shadows of rumor and speculation. It was within this tense interplay of proximity and distance, familiarity and fear, that the contours of his upbringing were shaped, preparing him for a life both constrained and remarkable, defined by the very secrecy that so captivated those outside the farmhouse walls. Inside the farmhouse, life unfolded according to a rhythm that was both exacting and relentless. Every day followed a pattern established by the parents, a sequence of tasks and routines that governed work, leisure, and even thought. The walls themselves seemed to hold the echoes of generations of practice, the smell of wood polish, cooking fires, and damp earth mingling to create an atmosphere that was at once protective and oppressive. From the earliest hours, the last son was immersed in a world where nothing occurred by accident and every action had meaning. The household operated as a self-contained universe, a place in which rules were absolute and deviation could provoke consequences both subtle and immediate. Mornings began before dawn. The father would rise first, moving silently through the rooms to inspect the livestock, check tools, and plan the day's work. His presence was both comforting and intimidating, a constant reminder that the household's survival depended on diligence, precision, and adherence to established procedures. The mother followed shortly after, preparing breakfast and overseeing the children's routines. Even eating was a structured affair. Each member had a defined place at the table, portions were measured, and conversation was limited to necessity. Silence, in this household, was not a void but a tool, a way to focus attention, cultivate observation, and reinforce the idea that every moment held significance. Chores consumed the majority of the day. The last son learned early how to care for the animals, tend the fields, and maintain the home. Work was not merely functional. It was infused with ritualistic precision. Feeding the animals, for instance, required a specific order, attention to detail, and careful observation of behavior. The father would correct even minor lapses, demonstrating the consequences of inattention while simultaneously teaching skills essential for survival. In this way, labor was both instruction and indoctrination, shaping the child's understanding of responsibility, consequence, and the world's inherent demands. Household maintenance followed a similar logic. Cleaning was meticulous, with every surface scrubbed, swept, or polished according to inherited practices. The mother oversaw these tasks with exacting standards, ensuring that the child learned to anticipate expectations and internalize discipline. Laundry, cooking, and repair work were performed not only for practical reasons but as exercises in observation, dexterity, and adherence to routine. Even leisure was subordinated to the household's overarching order. Play was permitted only when it aligned with the parents' rules and was framed as practice in precision, focus, or skill building. There were no spontaneous adventures, no unsupervised explorations, and little opportunity for unstructured interaction with the outside world. Religious and moral instruction permeated every aspect of daily life. The parents observed traditional Catholic practices, attending to prayer, ritual, and moral conduct with unwavering diligence. The child learned the rhythms of devotion, memorized prayers, and internalized the strictures of faith, all framed by the household's emphasis on discipline and observation. Yet even religion was intertwined with secrecy and ritual. Prayers were often recited in hushed tones, gestures performed with exacting care, and the significance of each act explained not only in spiritual terms but as part of the larger system of household order. The domestic, the spiritual, and the practical were inseparable, creating an environment in which the child absorbed the totality of the household's values, beliefs, and patterns. Education, too, was conducted within the home. Reading and writing were taught under close supervision, the curriculum selective and idiosyncratic. Knowledge of the outside world was filtered, presented in ways that reinforced caution and obedience rather than curiosity or independence. The last son learned history, mathematics, and moral lessons not as abstractions but as tools for navigating the world on the terms defined by his parents. Lessons were rigorous, repetition emphasized, and mistakes corrected immediately. This strict educational framework ensured that the child's mind developed in tandem with the household's physical and moral order, producing a disciplined, observant, and cautious individual. Within these routines, moments of mystery or peculiarity occasionally arose. Villagers spoke of strange practices observed from a distance, herbs burned at specific hours, cryptic symbols etched into doors or shutters, and the family moving silently through the night. While these actions were often rationalized by the household as part of daily chores, preparation for illness, or protection of property, to outsiders they took on an air of ritual, almost ceremonial in their precision. The last son grew up aware of these subtleties, learning that there were layers of meaning to daily actions, that appearances could be deceptive, and that observation was essential for understanding the household's inner logic. Food and sustenance, while essential, were also a medium of control and instruction. Meals were carefully planned to provide nutrition while reinforcing routine and expectation. Children were taught to appreciate structure in consumption, to follow strict schedules, and to respect the effort involved in preparation. The act of eating became a microcosm of the household's broader philosophy: attention to detail, respect for labor, and recognition that every action was embedded within a larger system. In this way, even the most mundane aspects of daily life were infused with meaning, shaping the child's awareness of order, consequence, and hierarchy. The natural environment surrounding the farmhouse played a complementary role in daily life. The fields, woods, and streams offered a controlled space for exploration, work, and observation. The child learned to navigate the terrain carefully, aware of boundaries, potential dangers, and the expectations of the household. Nature was not merely a backdrop but an extension of the parents' control, It was observed, respected, and integrated into the rhythm of daily life. Tasks in the field or forest were approached with the same precision as chores within the home, reinforcing a worldview in which the external and internal, the practical and the ritual, were inseparable. Psychologically, this structured, ritualized existence produced a blend of resilience, vigilance, and anxiety. The last son developed acute observational skills, an ability to anticipate consequences, and a deep awareness of the household's invisible rules. Yet alongside these strengths existed a profound constraint. Imagination, spontaneity, and social engagement were limited by the demands of routine, observation, and the ever-present authority of the parents. The child learned to navigate a complex world of order and secrecy, to understand the interplay between action and consequence, and to internalize the household's expectations in ways that would shape behavior long into adulthood. In this meticulously controlled environment, the family's secrets were preserved and transmitted. Every routine, ritual, and observation contributed to the maintenance of isolation, the reinforcement of discipline, and the cultivation of behaviors that would ensure survival, obedience, and secrecy. For the last son, daily life was both a protective cocoon and a framework of constraint. It provided structure, continuity, and instruction while simultaneously limiting freedom, social interaction, and exposure to the broader world. In this delicate balance, the household's influence on the child was profound, shaping not only his immediate experience but the trajectory of his identity, psychology, and eventual encounters with life beyond the farmhouse. Despite the careful routines and meticulous order of the household, tragedy was never far from the family's daily life. Death, illness, and unexplained occurrences seemed to follow in quiet succession, leaving an indelible mark on the last son and reinforcing the aura of secrecy that enveloped the household. From the perspective of the villagers, these events became evidence of something uncanny, a pattern that set the family apart from all others. To the child growing up within the farmhouse, they were less folklore and more a tangible part of existence, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the omnipresence of mortality in a household already shaped by isolation and ritual. Deaths within the family, though infrequent, carried enormous psychological weight. Parish records provide only the most basic details, names, ages, and dates, yet even these bare facts hint at patterns that might have influenced the household's culture of caution and secrecy. Some relatives died young, succumbing to illnesses that were poorly understood or untreated in the rural environment. Others perished under circumstances that were documented only in hushed oral accounts, a sudden fall in the barn, a mysterious fever that swept through the household, or an accident while tending the fields. Each death reinforced the sense of vulnerability and heightened the parents' insistence on control. The last son, observing these events from his earliest years, internalized the fragility of life and the necessity of vigilance, learning that deviation or carelessness could have consequences far beyond immediate correction. Illness, both chronic and sudden, was a pervasive presence. Previous generations had suffered from hereditary conditions, and the parents were acutely aware that the last son might inherit similar vulnerabilities. This awareness manifested in an almost obsessive attentiveness to health, careful monitoring of diet, sleep, and hygiene, coupled with the use of herbal remedies and traditional practices intended to ward off disease. Every cough, fever, or unexplained symptom was scrutinized, analyzed, and addressed within the household's own framework of knowledge. To outsiders, these measures might have seemed excessive or superstitious, but within the family, they were logical extensions of the lessons passed down through generations, lessons shaped by survival, heredity, and the ever-present specter of mortality. The household was also marked by events that defied conventional explanation, further fueling the perception of strangeness. Villagers spoke in hushed tones about fires that appeared without cause, objects moving in ways that suggested unseen hands, and sudden noises in empty rooms. Whether these incidents were products of imagination, coincidence, or subtle manipulation by the parents, they contributed to the household's reputation as a site of mystery and unease. For the last son, these experiences were formative. They taught him caution, observation, and awareness of the unknown. He learned to move quietly, to anticipate outcomes, and to interpret subtle signs in his environment as indicators of potential danger or hidden activity. In this way, even unexplained events served as a form of education, shaping his perception of the household as a place where vigilance was a survival skill. The interplay between tragedy and routine created a household culture that was both protective and oppressive. Daily life continued with meticulous order even in the wake of loss, emphasizing continuity, resilience, and adherence to established patterns. Yet this order also masked deeper anxieties, unspoken fears, and a pervasive awareness of mortality. The last son grew up observing the careful balance between life and death, routine and chaos, control and unpredictability. These early experiences instilled a heightened sensitivity to the fragility of existence and a recognition that the world could be both structured and indifferent, disciplined yet unpredictable. Neighbors and villagers were not immune to these events. News of illness, accidents, or deaths within the household often traveled through whispers and half-remembered stories, creating an atmosphere of speculation and rumor. Some claimed that the family was cursed, their misfortunes a consequence of sin or moral failing. Others argued that the tragedies were entirely natural, a product of genetics, hard labor, and the harshness of rural life. Regardless of interpretation, the effect was the same. The household was further set apart, framed as both a cautionary tale and a source of fascination. For the last son, growing up under this dual lens of internal experience and external perception, reality was inseparable from narrative. The events of daily life carried meaning not only within the household but in the eyes of the broader community. Certain incidents had a particularly lasting impact. The sudden death of a sibling, for example, was not simply a personal loss but a household-wide trauma that reshaped routines, increased vigilance, and intensified the parents' insistence on secrecy. The child learned early that grief was to be experienced quietly, that mourning was private, and that emotional restraint was a form of survival. Other events, such as accidents in the fields or illness among livestock, reinforced the notion that the world beyond the walls was dangerous and unpredictable, further justifying the household's insularity. Every tragedy, small or large, became a lesson in observation, caution, and adherence to rules. Beyond tangible misfortune, the household was also marked by subtler, psychological tragedies. The constant presence of mortality and illness instilled a persistent anxiety, a heightened sense of vulnerability that permeated daily life. The last son internalized these pressures, learning to anticipate danger, interpret subtle cues, and navigate the household's intricate web of expectations. While these skills fostered resilience and awareness, they also limited freedom, spontaneity, and emotional expression, producing a child who was highly capable in observation and adaptation but constrained by internalized fear and self-discipline. Some of the most chilling events were those left unrecorded, remembered only in fragmentary oral histories or hinted at in parish documents. A fire in the barn, extinguished before it could spread, livestock that disappeared mysteriously, sudden illnesses that resolved as inexplicably as they began. Each of these events, though minor in isolation, contributed to the cumulative sense of a household governed by forces both visible and invisible. The last son, immersed in this world, learned to read the signs, interpret anomalies, and understand the subtle interplay between order and chaos. In this way, tragedy was not merely a backdrop but an active participant in the shaping of his early life. Even the mundane aspects of household survival were imbued with a sense of potential peril. Fetching water from the well, tending crops in the field, or preparing meals could all carry risk if performed carelessly. The parents emphasized the importance of attention, repetition, and precision, teaching that even small mistakes could have serious consequences. In this environment, the child's awareness of mortality, fragility, and the need for vigilance was continuously reinforced, creating a mindset in which every action, no matter how routine, was led with significance. By the end of his early childhood, the last son had internalized the lessons of tragedy, observation, and caution. He had witnessed death and illness, encountered unexplained events, and learned to navigate a world defined by both routine and unpredictability. These experiences fostered resilience, discipline, and acute awareness, while simultaneously shaping a profound sensitivity to danger, secrecy, and the fragile nature of life. In the context of the household and the surrounding village, these formative experiences would continue to influence his behavior, relationships, and understanding of the world long into adolescence and adulthood, leaving a mark that was as enduring as it was invisible. As the last son moved into adolescence, the patterns of isolation and discipline that had defined his childhood intensified. The farmhouse, already a world apart, became even more insular, and the weight of the family's history pressed upon him with increasing force. Social interaction outside the household was minimal, limited to the occasional market visit or fleeting encounter with neighbors. These rare excursions reinforced the sense that the outside world was distant, unpredictable, and, at times, threatening. He learned to observe quickly, to anticipate the reactions of others, and to navigate conversations with caution. Even a simple misstep could invite judgment, suspicion, or rumor, lessons that were imprinted on him through both observation and the subtle guidance of his parents. Within the home, The household's rules became more complex and demanding. Chores increased in difficulty and responsibility, requiring not just physical skill but precision, judgment, and constant attention. The father's presence was a constant measure, a silent evaluation of work ethic and adherence to routine, while the mother's attention monitored behavior, appearance, and even emotional expression. The adolescent son absorbed these pressures, internalizing the household's expectations as a system that defined both identity and survival. Every action was weighed, every decision measured, and every deviation subtly corrected, cultivating a heightened awareness of consequence that shaped his thoughts and behaviors in ways that extended far beyond mere obedience. Psychologically, this period was fraught with tension. Adolescence is typically a time of exploration, rebellion, and experimentation. Yet for him, these natural impulses were constrained by the household's isolation and surveillance. Curiosity existed but was muted. Desire for connection with peers was redirected inward, toward observation, reflection, and careful planning. This environment fostered intelligence, resourcefulness, and acute perception, but it also amplified anxiety, self-consciousness, and a sense of otherness. The last son developed a mind finely attuned to subtle cues, able to read intentions, moods, and dangers with precision, yet it came at the cost of spontaneity and social fluidity. The natural surroundings continued to shape his adolescence. The fields, woods, and streams were simultaneously playground and classroom, offering space for skill development, exploration, and observation, but always within the limits imposed by the household. He learned to navigate terrain, recognize patterns in animal behavior, and anticipate changes in weather, all lessons in vigilance that mirrored the lessons of life inside the house. This constant interaction with the environment, framed by both opportunity and restriction, reinforced a worldview in which observation and caution were essential to survival. In these years, the last son also began to encounter subtle questions about identity and legacy. The family's reputation, isolation, and history of secrecy became more apparent to him, and he began to comprehend the magnitude of his role as the final thread in the lineage. This awareness brought both responsibility and burden. He was expected not merely to survive but to preserve the household's order, to embody its values, and to navigate a world beyond the farmhouse without undermining the family's legacy. Adolescence, typically a time of growth and self-definition, became instead a period of tension, reflection, and careful negotiation with both the household and the broader, distant society in which he lived.